Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully you can hear and see everything, see our posters here. My name is Dr. Lisa Diane Morrison, here from Queen Mary University of London, along with my colleague, Dr. Lillian Schofield. We'll be presenting our poster presentations to you all today. And this is a bit of a different type of approach to a poster presentation. We're all virtual, so this is new experience for many of us this year. And we want to take that relaxed feeling that hopefully we're all in a comfortable place, listening, watching, and we can have a great discussion about some of the impacts on catastrophic disasters, particularly in the nonprofit voluntary international development arena. So we welcome your participation. Thank you for attending today. And we will be asking for your input and just insight from your experiences as well as we share some of the things that both Dr. Schofield and I have experienced in our both academic research as well as work, life, and experiences in volunteering and in the sector. So with that said, I'll let you know how today's session will go. We will, first I'll tell you a little bit more about us and this forum and why we feel this is important and what we're going to take from this and why your participation will be wonderful. And then I will present to you the discussions as shown on my poster, which is you should be the blue to the right of your screen. And then followed by that, Dr. Schofield will come in and take over and present all of the information as you see and more on her poster you see to the left. If you have any questions around what's being said or what's written, do let us know and feel free to type in the chat and we're happy to help with that. So first I wanted to introduce this concept, this notion of looking at the impacts of catastrophic disasters, in this sector, which we find very interesting. The conversation now is centered a lot around responding to the pandemic, responding to COVID-19. But we know in this sector that these are situations that are often dealt with. It's a recurring role. So things are exacerbated by the current circumstances. And so how do we fudge through and make things work with organizations and communities balancing their responses and what and how they do among these really trying times where everyone is impacted. The helpers need help. So this is a continual discussion that we've introduced first by a symposium led by Dr. Schofield, looking at some of the impacts of COVID-19. But we want to expand this conversation beyond COVID-19, but we're well aware that it's at the forefront. And there are a lot of things that we're learning now. If there's any silver lining to a lot of the disasters that we've seen, there's conversations that people are more willing to have than they were able to have before. So now's a great time to introduce these discussions and some decision or solutions and thought processes that will help decision makers and key stakeholders and actually giving voice to more stakeholders. So this is what drives this particular discussion that we're interested in taking back and implementing in ways that could be applied in strategy and planning and teaching and learning, and even research methodologies, extracting from the communities and learning from the communities, and creating that space in order to enact changes and new ways of thinking and how to do things. So with that, Dr. Schofield is an expert in international development. She's done research in this arena, and I'm excited for you all to hear her conversations around that and things that she's experienced in the research and what she has to present. I myself, my field is in nonprofit organizations. I've done my research most recently, particularly around nonprofit organizations in the UK, particularly human social services organizations, dealing with small uh, community nonprofit, grassroots nonprofits. So I will present to you my poster that deals with some of the coping mechanisms and discussions around curating a discussion around coping mechanisms for the impact on a lot of nonprofit organizations. The impact of COVID-19 and the particularly challenging cycle for a lot of small and medium-sized nonprofit organizations that, as I mentioned before, have been exacerbated by COVID-19, this crisis, the challenges that organizations have always faced and are continuing to face due to, these changing environments. So just a little discussion around these challenges. A couple of things that I've highlighted, and this is, it's not limited to, so this is where we, later on we'll love to hear your experiences about your, understanding of some of the challenges and impact, but a few key things that I wanted to highlight from understanding how nonprofit, small and medium-sized organizations are impacted. And I can dare say this also can be very much applicable to large organizations as well. We know this is a lot to do with structure and how things are done. So this is not limited to, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things and things that include performance measures, which I think are significant because this is a conversation that ties these organizations to funding, right? So how well are they performed, how well are they evaluated, if they're fully received for what they're actually doing in these organizations, or is it just they're able to apply all tick boxes? Those kind of things are significant, I feel, are constant challenges for particularly small grassroots organizations, which are often under-resourced. Now that's without, I fully understand that there are some small and powerful organizations, but my focus is on those community nonprofit organizations, maybe even some micro charities that actually are barely able to make the threshold to even receive certain types of funding because of lack of resources and things of that nature. So that's a couple of things I wanted to discuss and highlight. This notion of performance measures tied to funding, how that has impact on the organizations, and how perhaps we can have further discussions about how we can make changes to expectations, understandings, and what we can actually learn from these organizations in the way of how we measure their success or their outcomes. Another area for discussion I'd like to cover is technology and the use of technology, the lack of technology, the overdependence of technology. I think there's lots of conversations around technology and expectations, and this again can be tied to performance measures. This need to constantly measure impact. How do you measure the help of human services? How do you do that? And technology can be an advantage, and it also can be disruptive in a not in the disruptive technology way that we talk about, Uber and those kind of companies, but in the way of not allowing organizations to get to the meat and potatoes or the crux of what they really need to do. So we'll have a discussion about that. And then crisis competition, this notion of crisis competition, particularly around this time with COVID-19, so many people are impacted by the same thing for the first time in a while. This has happened, we know, time and time again, but COVID-19 has added a little different nuance to what some of these organizations are dealing with. So how does that affect organizations on the ground compared to organizations that have the reach, that are larger, those type of resources? And then last, I'd like to wrap up the conversation with this notion of the community building that comes from these grassroots community organizations, and how actually there's something to be learned from from these organizations to the private sector, the public sector, et cetera. This notion of community of practice, this notion of this tacit knowledge that these organizations hold on to in the communities that actually eludes governments, it eludes larger organizations. And perhaps now is a time that we're able to all stop and take a pause and maybe introduce into the conversation the expertise that the grassroots community organizations actually have to offer, and how they operate, what they're doing, how they share among the community and help others. So, so the performance measures, we know that in the NPO or nonprofit sector and in international development, there's a rich history in social responsibility. And so, kind of harkening back to what I've just mentioned about what we can learn from these organizations. These organizations are familiar with dealing with pressures of rigorous evaluation methods, particularly, I would say this inception, per se, perhaps for many organizations, maybe in the West, and dealt with what's the word I'm looking for? Professionalization of the nonprofit. We know we can look at grassroots and community organizations that have absolutely nothing to do with performance measures. They need no agenda, some of those micro charities that we talked about, but it hasn't stopped the steamroll of, needing to show impact, needing to show measures of success, which by and large are absolutely understood and necessary. We want to be held accountable. We want, you have public funds, those things are significant, but are they applicable to all organizations? Are we having a fair look into what these organizations are actually doing, particularly those who are dealing with, as I define, human social services, organizations helping individuals to seek shelter, safety, and food, emergencies, substance use, things that are not as straightforward to measure, because you're dealing with people's lives, you're dealing with how people live and how they respond, and their emotions, their mental health, how they're able to handle the things around them. So, this need to obviously adhere to accountability and standards and measures are necessary. However, are they sensitive to the needs of these organizations, right? And oftentimes these measures are set up by organizations or individuals that are not thinking of the differences or that dichotomy between these different organizations. So the pressures of these external organizations, external meaning government funders, whatever the case may be, even larger nonprofit organizations are imposed on these smaller grassroots community nonprofits. And the question is, are they conducive to the strategies that are applicable to in these organizations, the organization's nature, and their culture? Sorry, distraction there. Please excuse me. So this is, an important part of the conversations and so funders now, interestingly, and not exclusively, but it's interesting to have this conversation now regarding COVID-19 and the impact, because here we also see in these times that funders are now affected by some of these, extreme financial circumstances across the board. So, as they are affected by COVID-19, the question is, will there be an understanding for these nonprofit organizations? Or maybe it will be missed, as some larger organizations, whether they're private or public or even larger NGOs, have a quicker recovery time, right? And does this exacerbate and make things more difficult for these organizations, smaller organizations, grassroots community organizations, to compete and survive? Or will this be a time of leveling the playing field, is the question. And perhaps now this is the time to have that conversation. We know that standards and measures for performance for accountability often to an organization's nature or their culture. So for example, I've had experience working in mental health, social services, substance use, organizations, and receiving federal funding, receiving large contractual funding, and requiring for individuals to be healed or to never be hospitalized within 90 days. People dealing with some serious traumatic psychiatric issues, some serious substance abuse issues, and making their way forward. And how do you hold a time scale against that? Is there a better way that we can measure those kind of successes? So it can be very restrictive. That might be, maybe those type of strict measures may work if the job of the organization is to hand out so many wool blankets, in a community. You can count that to something measurable, but how do you then apply that to individuals in their healing process and dealing with all types of various different pressures? So those kind of restrictions, those are the type of restrictions that I'm talking about, matching the differences in the organization's culture and actually just what they do, and just assessing without discernment for the unique context of those community organizations, and the potential of having such a negative impact on those organizations if these said organizations are not deemed successful, what the impact that has in the community and the individuals in the community. And we see this often in the case of social services, human social services organizations. Again, highlighting organizations that are dealing with mental health, things of that nature. So that's just some of the conversation around performance measures, the impact of catastrophes on organizations, or really, these are continual situations that these organizations have had to deal with in this mismatch. Oftentimes the performance measures are how we look at them. And so moving forward with this, perhaps maybe a pause for some, or again, as I mentioned, it may even accelerate the differences between organizations. We will see. So I'm mindful of the time, Dr. Schofield, so I'll be just a few more moments. So I'll just briefly talk about technology. This notion of, we're increasingly becoming a technological dependent society, and highlighting the further significance or benefits that this may have on these type of organizations. And so one of the interesting things that of interest to me is to find that oftentimes these smaller grassroots community organizations actually have very sophisticated information management skills and processes that are forced to use oftentimes technologies that are a mismatch, or we oftentimes don't really measure the impact of technological use. And this is not to say that they shouldn't, but I'm aware of some funders actually require some organizations to download particular software and things of that nature that aren't necessarily applicable. And are we looking at the strategies? And I've had the experience of looking at some organizations who had excellent manual technological strategies that I think could be implemented digitally if taken the time. So I'll just skip through that. I'm mindful of the time. The notion of crisis competition, this limited resources for nonprofits, and this increased pressure to compete, to receive support. We know that there are issues in organizations that people are repetitive. This person wants to help pass out blankets, that person wants to help pass out blankets, and they want their own organization, right? But we also see great solutions where organizations come together and say, well, let's pass out blankets together. The significant demand for resources, it creates this urgency. And oftentimes it can take precedence over outcomes. It can disrupt some of the great strategies and things that are necessary for the organization to operate as well. Again, again, tied back to performance measures, how it can be dismissive of organizations' processes and if they don't receive that funding. So last, I'll just say in brief, the notion of community of practice. So when I talk about, I've mentioned how we can learn what strategies these organizations may have, highlighting this practice of this mutually defined community, the significant aspects of community of practice theory or situated learning. This idea of sharing and learning knowledge should contribute to the organization's practice. And there has been some research of how this knowledge sharing, this experiences within organizations and their processes and their culture can actually be a benefit to A, how we view these organizations, and B, their processes and outcomes. So again, I am mindful of the time. I'm excited to have more discussion with everyone later on about perhaps more about this, but I wanted to pass the time on to Dr. Schofield, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. As mentioned by Dr. Morrison, today's session, we hope to gain more insight into how the global pandemic has impacted and is affecting communities, organizations, especially in developing countries. Lisa touched on 3 great points that I will draw on in my own presentation here, and that is that of technology, crisis management and performance measures, as well as this competition for limited funding. So I hope I will expand on that, and hopefully we can begin that conversation beyond the outbreak and imagining the aftermath. And we hope to hear from you. So the aim of this poster presentation is to start that conversation, to see some of the lessons that we can learn. Also the emerging issues, which I'll be focused on in this presentation, and as well as throwing questions to educators out there, the researchers, the practitioners, what you're doing in terms of how you're reframing, how you teach, how you do social development or economic development, or even social change in the organizations that you do these practices in. And I think the main question that we're asking from this presentation is, how are organizations, institutions, practitioners responding to the structural changes and challenges in light of the global pandemic? And we extend it to a broader question, which is, how do we reframe how we do this social change, taking into consideration the wider social and political context, also the power structures, which I think I will touch on. I think we can't talk about development without talking about power structures that come into play when we talk about disruptive catastrophes and moving away from what used to be the norm. So just quick information, we've shared the same poster so you can be able to see some of the information we put there clearer on the Hoover platform. So after the discussion, please go to Hoover platform. We have a forum, Business, Society and Social Change, and we can continue the conversation there too. So I'll quickly start from one of the points Dr. Morrison touched upon, and which is the impact of the global pandemic. I feel it's appropriate to start with that, the impact the global pandemic has had on human lives, on organizations, and how we do things, for example, the virtual conference. However, apart from the global pandemic, there have been other significant events that have happened in the last year that we have seen the power of organizing, a rise in social movement, and the coming together of people from all walks of life, confronting issues of racial injustice, inequalities, power structures. We've seen this especially over the death of George Floyd. And in the African continent, we've seen similar movements also rising. For example, the End SARS movement in Nigeria. And we also saw similar movements also in Uganda with political agitations and in different countries within the continent. And I think one of the main issues and the questions that this was raising was a wider debate and critique in how organizations respond to inequality, social justice, and public health crisis. And I will expand on this point, touching on three key issues. And just like Dr. Morrison mentioned, these are just a few, and hopefully you would be sharing with us some of the emergent issues in your own field. And it ties in with some of the key points Dr. Morrison touched upon, and that of power. So I'll be putting that under deglobalization. Are we in this era now? And what that means for countries in Africa, then power structures, then we cannot talk about the continent without talking about the issues of poverty, security, and conflict in the countries, and some of the changes that are happening as a result of this. So I'll take the first point about deglobalization and how it's crucial in how it's shaping this disruptive catastrophe. So I think it's always great if we go back and look back in history. Deglobalization is nearly always a time of standoff among great powers. So this was certainly the case with the manipulation by imperial powers in the 1930s, especially with European-based charity organizations working in many African countries. We see the use of nonprofits in the humanitarian and development fields as instrument of what Joseph Nye termed soft power in helping to carry out some of the colonial agendas. But today we're seeing this in relation not to the Western power, but to that of China. And we're seeing this in terms of, for their profits initiative under umbrellas of Chinese donor work in the continent. As we're seeing this change of power happening, we're also seeing withdrawal of power. So in the last administration in the United States of America, when it was in its neo-isolationist phase, and how it withdrew from that international development space compared to how it was during the post-war years. What's also important in this last deglobalization is to measure developments which has occurred, reshaping how non-profit organizations function. So the first then was this emergence, proliferation of non-governmental organizations, of associations within the African continent. And then the second was how these organizations began to work with international organizations, the United Nations. And it's interesting to note what's happening now in relation to this pandemic. So you have, the pandemic reconfiguring how organizations work within the continent. And Dr. Morrison, you mentioned about community practice. So with the lack of or the limited funding, what are some of these organizations doing? So you have more community-based organizations now also filling in that gap that is absent from government provisioning. So how are they doing this development in the absence of international travel, with the travel restrictions and with limited funding? And it's interesting and significant space to watch out how this relationship will again develop post the pandemic. Another complication to pay attention, especially within African countries, is the way that the currency is moving. So when we talk about globalization and globalization, we also need to think about the ways the currencies are moving. And when you see how it's moving against the dollars and the implication for this in terms of transnational payment. So as deglobalization deepens, there is the need to think about transnational payment and the challenges this poses for African countries. So the currencies in many of these countries have fallen further against the dollar, leading to challenge of net debt, which again is dominated in dollars. So this may lead many countries to turn to China for borrowing. And that's what we're seeing in many countries, for example, Nigeria and other African countries turning to China for borrowing. And then what's the implication for this, post the pandemic? And my next point on still the deglobalization point is that of remittance economy. The current crisis has had major effect on remittance economy. But then again, you think about some of the restrictive policies and regulation coming in from many of these African countries that have greatly affected remittances to the country. So, for example, Nigeria has, with the ban of the international money transfer operators and the integration of payment services has affected diaspora remittances. So that's another key emerging issue to look at, how this goes, again, beyond the pandemic and the effect on communities. The second emerging issue that I wanted to touch upon, and which you discussed, Dr. Morrison, was power and power structures. And I think it's somewhere within, again, that limited funding, that community practice, that crisis management, the argument within some of those points that you made. And if we look at the deepening power tensions, not only in terms of competition among non-profit organizations in terms of funding, but how they work with donors, right? So you touched on the limited funding there, Dr. Morrison, and we also have to look at how they also deal with donors and how they will deal with donors after the pandemic. It is interesting to see how this plays out between local and community-based organizations and northern-based nonprofits, or whether a new type of partnerships would develop. We know that many northern-based nonprofits are also struggling financially. If we look at the charity sector, again, many charity did suffer from, because of the pandemic. So that relationship between northern-based and southern-based NGOs is an interesting one that we have to look at. There's also significant important points to look at in terms of non-profit and private sector partnerships. So not only are we looking at the global south and the global north, but we're also looking at the non-profit and private sector partnership. And it's the point that you touched on. So before the global pandemic, there was this reconfiguration in the development space of where the private sector is. So the private sector took on carrying out different development work, which used to be in the domain of the non-profit sector. The non-profit sector used to be the darling of the development. And in the past few years, we've had the private sector taking over, doing many of the development work. So it's significant to continue to look at the space and what emerges as a result of this reconfiguration. Apart from that, there's also the large multinationals, again, playing within the space in terms of their social and corporate social responsibility programs. So as we have many players come into the development field, that competition that you touched about on can be expanded to look at the different players and how they, again, come together post the pandemic, or how this relationship evolves. And I think the final point I want to touch on this before I move into my last point would be that of discussion about nationalism. I think that we don't touch more on this nationalism and the rise of populism quite enough when we talk about development. And this has been changes happening within the last few years, especially in Western countries. So we need to talk about this in relation to what this means for NGOs and community-based organizations in developing countries. with the pandemic and restrictions of movement, including international movement, local and community-based organizations, you can see them rising to the challenge, supporting communities, using their expertise without depending on external help or interference. So again, this is another one to watch out for. How is this relationship developing? And the last point that I wanted to touch on is that of poverty, security, conflict in the African continent. So we know that coronavirus has reached every country in the African continent. Although we've not had the report that the virus has, affected people the way it's affected people in Western countries, it's had an impact on lives there. It's had an impact on the economy, affecting the small and medium-scale enterprises and community-based organizations, as well as non-profit organizations. The lockdown measure, most especially, had a devastating effect on communities, especially the vulnerable groups who could not find food, or who did not have the income to survive the lockdown measure. For some communities, they preferred to go out there because they're dependent on informal economy. So that's how their livelihood is gotten. So with the lockdown, that really affected how their livelihood and also affording food. So those who depend on those informal economy for daily sustenance were highly affected by that lockdown measures. This challenge was further exacerbated due to the lack of social protection in many of the vulnerable communities. So there's also that issue of public health, especially with limited or lack of facilities in these informal settlements, or even in communities, how it affected human lives there. Then we talk about the disruption to daily livelihood, such as the impact on communities being able to go out there to earn money and also get some of their basic needs. Then again, we touch on community-based organizations and non-profit organizations that usually come in to fill in the gap, some of the limitations that they had due to the lockdown measures. So many of these non-profit organizations were unable to go out there because of the lockdown. Everybody was on lockdown, so there was nobody leaving their homes to go and help other people. And the impact that had on lives. Also, that point you touched on, Dr. Morrison, on limited funding, that also affected how help was given to some of these vulnerable communities. So you think about non-profit organizations that depended on funding from different streams. They used to get funding from different streams, such as diaspora, northern-based NGOs, multilateral, bilateral organizations, with those funding stopping, or to some extent not being there, and how this also affected how the help that was given to communities. And as we know, again, how the northern-based NGOs are struggling also to survive due to the pandemic. So if we go back to look at the international humanitarian and northern-based NGOs, some of the local nonprofits that were dependent on them were also facing closures, were also facing their own problems, solutions that they couldn't solve. So again, that of struggling, surviving as an organization was also an issue that was raised by the pandemic. And if we talk about the cost of running businesses, staff being furloughed, travel restrictions, which has also affected, NGOs in developing countries, then we see how this has affected communities that usually benefit from these non-governmental organizations. So the question is, what are some of the strategies adopted by local NGOs and community-based NGOs to survive beyond the pandemic? And how are they reframing how they do social change with some of these measures that have come out due to the pandemic? I think that's a significant lesson, an area to look at. And I will conclude, not to take all the time, quickly by highlighting the impact of the pandemic countries experiencing protracted conflicts, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, Cameroon, Northern Nigeria. There are several layered and complex issues that we can't talk about that even go beyond inadequate government response, fragile healthcare systems, government policies, as well as the lack of social protection. I think the discussion would be, to delve into this, we'll have to delve into the systems rooted in colonial systems that are no longer working for the people, and the struggle to disrupt and dismantle the system in place, which is affecting how communities are rising up against themselves, the government, in order to protest for a change. And I think I've touched on some of those key points that you touched on, Dr. Morrison, and I'll stop here and open up the discussion now by posing this question for all of us for reflection. And the question is, we want to hear from you all, especially academics, researchers, and practitioners. What are some of the emerging issues that you've come across in your field? And has any of the points that we touched on resonated with you? We're especially interested in how we are to reframe how we do development, social change, in terms of pedagogies, methodologies that we use, as well as some of the case studies that we include in our teaching. So as I give you time, feel free to unmute, turn on your camera to join the conversation. And I will touch a bit on methodologies as well as pedagogy. So the global pandemic has really affected how we teach, do development. We're all virtual on using virtual platforms in teaching, but also a great importance is how we gather data in terms of this inequality that has been exposed by the global pandemic. And this is what I touch upon, a point Dr. Morrison touched on, which is technology. So it can be a great advantage. We've seen the advantages of technology. We're here having this great conference, but also it has its disadvantages that those in developing countries, some of these technologies are not available to them. And if we are doing development studies without reaching out to grassroots, reaching out to community organizations, via technology, how are we doing it? How are we gathering this information that we're going to be using in teaching? So post-pandemic, and with the emerging issues happening, how are we bringing together our learning, lessons learned, in terms of how we bring it to the classroom? And these are some of the reflections that I'm having in terms of some of the points that we've given. Dr. Morrison, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I'm excited to hear everyone else's response as well, reflecting on, as mentioned, these are some of, but not limited to, some of these emerging issues. I like how Dr. Schofield kind of highlight around that. As we both, I think, have talked about, these are continual issues that the sector has had, but really interested in how we tackle a lot of these emerging issues. I also wanted to acknowledge in the chat, I apologize that the posters are poor. We tried several ways to upload this onto Wova and had a bit of difficulty, but we'll certainly try and provide you all with better copies as soon as we can. But we thank you for being here, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing, your thoughts, as Dr. Schofield has said as well. How do we strategize? How do we extract? How do we communicate? And I love the conversation, Dr. Schofield, as well, as about nationalism, and in the sense of, technology opens borders, but it also can close them as well, this disruption. So I see someone turn on their camera. I'll give it over to you, Dr. Schofield, to host. And I don't know if you'd like to share, if you turned your camera on, we'd be excited to hear.
Hi, Josephine. Do you want to share with us? Hi, Fiorenzo. Yes.
Yeah, I'm actually I just read on your poster, which is really tiny, is something about the community of practice and information management and so on, and organizational learning. And as far as I know, there's quite a high staff turnover for projects, so that learning is actually hard to achieve. Maybe can you share some insights about how that may have changed during the pandemic? Also, if much of the staff has maybe dropped out of the development system, just stopping to be development workers. Do you have any data?
I'll first answer the question regarding the community of practice. That's a very good point in the high turnover, which is something that's experienced in these sectors as well. So then we look at the notion of objects, of how that tacit knowledge then gets translated into explicit, whether that is the way that the processes are occurred, the way that information is taken down or managed, and then that is then retained within the organization. But that is not to say, as well as the brain drain, so to speak, that many nonprofit organizations have to deal with, and because of the high turnover, and also because traditionally, the selection of all volunteer, whoever can, and so you have a variety of skill sets, and how that if those strategies are not implemented to make that tacit knowledge explicit, then that person's knowledge it carries away. But there's something to be said about the processes within the organizations and strategies and how that gets applied. And you ask people, why are we doing this? You have no idea that someone 20 years ago implemented this process. So it's about us having a different look in these organizations and saying, yes, the numbers show there's high turnover, but when we look at the actual processes and how people are learning, and even the verbal sharing, the water cooler talk, so to speak. One of the things that Michael Earl talks about in knowledge management, as well as these spaces where information gets exchanged, and even just that one exchange, how that has impact on how things are done. But again, not to take away, you're absolutely right. If that is not explicitly provided, or if it's not put in objects, and when I say objects, that's inclusive of documentation, inclusive of pictures, or whatever the case may be, something tangible, then it does get carried away. So I hope that helps as a part of the discussion. But that's one of the things that I'd like to challenge in that in organizations and small nonprofit organizations, is that their actual processes and strategies are things that are carried on, and perhaps we can look at that a bit closer.
Thank you, Josephine, for that question. And I think just to add to Lisa's point, I think we don't give much attention to local and indigenous knowledge production when we talk about community practice. I think that also comes under that, especially if we talk in terms of inclusive knowledge, inclusive co-production. And when we talk about that, we move away from thinking that knowledge or that community practice is something that comes from, organizations or top down, but we begin to embrace the local knowledge that is there. We begin to embrace indigenous knowledge. And I like Linda Tuhiwe-Smith's work on indigenous methodologies that brings all these arguments together. And I think when we begin to expand our discussions beyond organizations as we know it, and embracing different organizations, from grassroots organizations to community-based organizations in this community practice, then we begin to see fuller pictures. We begin to have an inclusive kind of knowledge when we bring together these discussions together. But great point, Dr. Morrison. Fiorenzo, do you have any question or something to add?
Yeah, hi. So first of all, I wanted to thank you, Lisa and Lillian, for the amazing presentation, because it was very thorough and comprehensive, and you've touched so many different points, which actually resonated with my own presentation in this conference. So I'm participating to the NGOs in Development Study Group. And we will be looking at, because our panel is happening at the end of the conference on Friday, focusing exactly on the impacts of the pandemic on NGOs, both in the global north and the global south. And for my research, I'm focusing on the global north. Actually, I'm looking at how I'm just looking at the evolution of Italian development NGOs over time in terms of organizational structures and practices as well. So not much the impact that NGOs have on the field, but what happens in like the headquarters, main offices, and so on and so forth. And in occasion of this conference, I've prepared a very brief working paper touching on some of the issues that you also presented. So it really resonated with me how NGOs or community-based organizations, I mean, it's a very broad group, very differentiated. So, but it is really interesting how organizations across the globe experience the same sort of trends, you know. So when you were talking about, so what I've witnessed through my own research is that the pandemic has served somehow as an accelerator of trends that were already going on. So it has brought disruption, yes, but working on disruptions that were already at work before, both in terms of potential positive outcomes coming to coping strategies, but mostly negative trends that were already there. Also in the Italian context, like the differentiation between organizations. So you were mentioning that also in your presentation. This recovery capacity of NGOs really depends on the resources they were already able to secure in the past. So what we were witnessing in Italy is also a deepening between the capabilities of organizations based on how much resources they had already in the past. You talked about professionalization, which is a huge trend in the global north generally, and in Italy as well, the dependency on funding. So no, generally, I didn't have a specific question, but I just wanted to thank you for sharing this knowledge with us, because it is very interesting for me to see that these trends are happening elsewhere as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to take a closer look to the poster so that I can join more dots. Then we'll find a way to share it in a more proper quality.
Thank you so much, Ferenzo. I think you made so much great points, and bringing together some of your own experiences and in your own presentation. But thank you so much for that, especially that of professionalism, which we touched upon. I believe we can make changes by learning from some of these emerging issues that we've touched upon, and keep learning and seeing how we can incorporate them in our own practice. In terms of making this posters visible, we've tried several ways, Dr. Lisa, but how do we, I mean, we've posted it on Hoover platform.
Yeah, I was wondering, perhaps we'll speak with the administrators and see if it can be uploaded in the document section or someplace. Yes, we have tried several spaces, so do apologize trying to get that together. But I do want to also thank you both for your questions, Josephine and I'm sorry, the name just left. Oh, sorry. I'm having issues with my screen here, but you both bring up very interesting points. And it is good to have these conversations, because I think especially at this particular level, one of the things is the bottom, people talk about the bottom up approach, but I think there needs to be more discussion and more application of those discussions in some of the larger realms. And this is, I think we're, in the wake of this professionalism that we talked about, of things needing to look and be presented in a particular way, but maybe because of, as mentioned, the challenges now that are exacerbated by this global pandemic that's affecting those who probably the untouchables, so to speak, if I can be quite candid, right? Maybe this can be a pause to kind of interject again some of these continual conversations, things that have been going on. We're not introducing anything new, but how we respond to them may be new and how others may receive them. At least that's what we hope.
Okay, so it's 10:56. I think it's time to bring the whole session to a close. Thank you so much, Josephine Ferenzo, for joining, participating, asking questions, and also contributing from your own practice. We hope to continue the conversation on Hoover, where we have this, our posters there. We'll also ask the administrators if they could post the PDF copies for us, just like Dr. Morrison mentioned, so that you can view some of the key points that we've highlighted in our posters. Please feel free to join us at Hoover, where Lisa and I will be very, keen to chat and have conversations regarding this topic. But thank you so much for joining us, and see you later. Lisa, do you have to say anything?
Thank you. I echo everything Dr. Schofield said. Thank you both. Appreciate your conversation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.